The rainy streets of Chicago glistened under the dim light of the sodium lamps, reflecting a brilliance that made the city seem like a living, breathing creature, full of secrets it was in no hurry to reveal. Michael sat in his battered chair, coffee-stained and armrest scuffed, staring out the apartment window at the blurry streaks of headlights streaking through the night. His laptop hummed on the coffee table, the screen emitting a cold blue light that cast a ghostly glow over his face. Lines of code stared back at him like a maze of logic he could decipher even in his sleep, but tonight his mind was elsewhere. The clock on the wall ticked toward 2 in the morning, each sound a small accusation. Emily was out. Again. She said she was taking an extra shift at the hospital, her voice clipped and tired on the phone. "No one to work, Mike. You know how it is." He nodded into the phone, murmuring something supportive, but the words sounded hollow, like a script that had been read too many times. Emily's shifts had become chaotic lately, out of keeping with the normal hospital chaos. She was a nurse, sure, but even nurses had schedules. Weekends. And yet her weekends had a habit of dissolving into nights out, her bag slung over her shoulder, mumbling vague excuses about extra hours or meeting a friend for a quick drink. Michael wasn't stupid. He'd been coding long enough to notice patterns, and this one was screaming in his face. But suspicions were dangerous things. They bit, and once they got a hold, they wouldn't let go. The apartment was too quiet without her. The hum of the refrigerator, the distant wail of a siren, the occasional creak of the house settling on its bones, it all seemed a mockery of the life they'd built together. 10 years of marriage, a mortgage they could barely afford, and a rhythm of existence that had once felt as comfortable as the steady ticking of a metronome. Now everything was out of rhythm. Michael rubbed his temples, his fingers rough against the stubble sprouting on his jaw. He hadn't shaved in days. He'd barely slept. The code on the screen blurred as his mind wandered back to the last real conversation he'd had with Emily, not the casual chat about bills or groceries, but the ones that had lasted into the early hours of the morning when they were younger, when her laughter could pull him out of any hole. He stood up and paced the small living room, his socks scraping against the threadbare carpet. The air was faintly scented with her perfume, something floral with a hint of citrus, like a ghost lingering in the room. Her jacket hung casually over the back of the couch, thrown down in her haste before yet another departure. Michael's fingers brushed the material, and for a moment he considered rummaging through his pockets. A check, a note, a matchbook from some seedy bar, anything that would confirm the nagging feeling in his gut. But he stopped. Not now. Rummaging would make this real, and he wasn't sure he was ready for that truth. The phone on the table vibrated, making him jump. A message from Emily. "I will be soon." Don't wait short, sharp, like a knife thrust. He stared at the words, his thumb hovering over the answer button. "Where are you?" I wanted to print. "Who are you with?" But he didn't. Instead, he threw his phone on the couch and grabbed his jacket. If he was going to drown in questions, he might as well do it somewhere that served something stronger than the cold coffee in his mug. The bar was a dive called the Black Cat, sandwiched between a pawn shop and a 24-hour laundromat. Neon signs buzzed in the window, promising cheap beer and even cheaper company. Michael pushed open the door and was hit by a wave of cigarette smoke and spilled whiskey. The place was half dead, a few regulars hunched over their drinks, their faces worn from living too long in a city that didn't care about them. The jukebox played something low and wistful, a saxophone wriggling like a snake in the smoky air. He settled onto a stool at the bar, nodding at the bartender, a guy named Lou with a face like a crumpled paper bag. "Whiskey. Neat," Michael said, his voice rougher than he'd expected. Lou didn't ask questions, just poured and slid the glass across the bar. Michael wrapped his fingers around it, the warmth of the drink seeping into his palms. He wasn't a drinker, not at all, but he needed something to smooth things over tonight. "Rough night?" Lou asked, wiping down the counter with a rag that looked older than the bar itself. Michael shrugged, looking into the amber liquid. "Hard life." Lou chuckled, a dry, raspy sound. "You don't say it, but you look like you're chasing something you don't want to catch." Michael caught his eye briefly, but then looked down at his glass. Yes, there are things you can't run from. He took a sip, heat spreading through his chest. His thoughts went back to Emily, to the smile that had once lit up a room, and how she didn't smile anymore. They had been happy, hadn't they? Back when he was climbing the ladder at the tech firm, before the layoffs and the freelance gigs that barely covered the bills. Back when she wasn't pulling double shifts or whatever she did now. The distance between them had grown slowly, like fog creeping off a lake, until one day he realized he didn't know her anymore. Not really. A woman sat down on the stool next to him, her perfume cutting through the musty air of the bar, a heavy, musky scent unlike Emily's light one. She was probably in her 30s, her dark hair pulled back into a messy bun, her dress clinging to her figure as if it had been painted on. Her lips were too red, as if she had just bitten into a ripe fruit. She didn't look at him, just ordered a gin and tonic in a voice that sounded like it had seen too many sleepless nights. Long night? She asked, not taking her eyes off her glass as the bartender placed it in front of her. Michael almost laughed. Something like that. She turned her head slightly, just enough for him to catch the glint in her eyes sharp, like she could see right through him. You look like you're dragging a question you're afraid to ask. He tensed, his fingers tightening around the glass. Are you a psychologist? She chuckled, taking a sip from her glass. Nah, just good at reading people. My name is Vivian. Michael, he replied, more out of habit than interest. Michael, she repeated, as if tasting the name. So what's bothering you, Michael? Problems with your wife? With your job? Or just plain existential angst? He didn't answer right away, just took another sip of whiskey, letting the burn drown out the urge to spill it all to the stranger. But there was something about her, maybe the way she leaned in a little closer, or the way her voice held a slight mockery, like a challenge. Let's just say I'm trying to figure out what's real and what's not. Vivian's smile widened, but it wasn't warm. It was the kind of smile that knew too much, the kind that made you wonder what you'd just gotten yourself into. Oh, honey, that's the game, isn't it? Figuring out what to believe in. They were silent for a minute, the machine switching to something slower, sadder. Michael's thoughts swirled, returning to Emily. The late nights, the excuses, the way she'd started blocking her phone. He wanted to believe it was nothing just stress, just the pressures of their lives tearing them apart. But doubt was poison, and it was already poisoning his blood. Have you ever felt like you were living with a stranger? He asked, the words escaping before he could stop them. Vivian raised an eyebrow, swirling her glass. All the time. People wear masks, Michael. Sometimes they don't even realize they're doing it. The question is, what are you going to do about it? He didn't have an answer. Not yet. But her question hung in the air like smoke, curling around him, refusing to dissipate. Back at the apartment, he heard the key turn in the lock as the first gray rays of dawn filtered through the blinds. Emily walked in, her scrubs rumpled, her hair pulled back into a messy ponytail. She looked exhausted, but there was something else in her eyes, something guarded, as if she were hiding a secret she was keeping at arm's length. Hi, she said, dropping her bag on the kitchen counter with a dull thud that seemed to underscore the tension in the room. A thin trickle of rain dripped from her fingers. It was damp and chilly outside. Her coat clung to her arms, and her wet hair hid under her hood. She didn't even take off her shoes, just stood there for a moment, listening to the silence. You got up early. I couldn't sleep, Michael said. His voice was flat, almost lifeless, as if he were trying to hold himself back from something more. He sat in his favorite leather chair by the window, his back stiff and straight, his hands clenched into fists on the armrests. His laptop sat closed next to him, and a glass of amber liquid reflected the dim light from the lamp. The whiskey was still burning in his veins, but it wasn't a heady warmth that he felt, more like a caustic anxiety that wouldn't let him rest. She nodded, avoiding his gaze, and moved to the sink. The sound of running water filled the kitchen, soft but steady, like drop after drop on stone. He watched her move, quickly, economically, as if she wanted to keep her hands busy so she wouldn't have to talk. The way her shoulders tensed under the thin fabric, not from the cold, but from an inner tension that couldn't be hidden. He felt something heavy and inevitable rising inside him. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice soft but with a sharp edge to it, like a knife blade wrapped in velvet. "Fine," she answered too quickly, without turning around. "Just tired. Long shift." Silence fell between them again, thicker than before. He could hear the drips on the metal of the sink, the faint creak of the floorboards under her footsteps. He wanted to press, to say out loud what was tearing apart in his chest, to ask where she had been, with whom, but the words were stuck, went deep into his throat like shards of glass, and scratched painfully from the inside. Instead, he slowly rose from the chair, feeling how tense his muscles were. Silence enveloped every step. He came up and stood behind her. She froze as his hand settled on her shoulder, hesitantly, reservedly. He felt her muscles twitch beneath his fingers, as if her body had tightened in surprise or guilt. He said quietly, "If something's wrong, you can tell me." For a split second, she didn't move. Then she turned slowly, and her eyes met his. There was no longer a mask in them. Something alive, something anxious, flashed in her gaze. Fear, or maybe regret. For the first time in a long time, she wasn't pretending. "It's okay, Mike," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm just tired." She turned away and walked toward the bedroom, her steps quick, almost hurried. As she passed, he caught a scent. Subtle but foreign. Heavy, musky, like the woman's perfume from the bar with notes of tobacco, spice, and something deeply animal. His stomach clenched. He stood in the silent kitchen, the doubt he had tried to suppress for so long now spreading its wings inside him, cold and sharp as a knife blade in the dark. Michael sat at the kitchen table, surrounded by the silence of an apartment that now seemed foreign, almost hostile. His laptop was open, but instead of lines of code, tabs flickered on the screen, hosting electronic sites' hidden cameras, tiny devices promising the truth in exchange for a few $100s. His fingers hovered over the keyboard, and something heavy, like shame, churned in his chest. He didn't want to do this. He didn't want to stoop to surveillance, to turn their marriage into a spy thriller. But the scent of someone else's perfume that he'd caught on Emily the night before wouldn't go away. It was etched in his memory, like a stain that wouldn't come out. Michael rubbed his eyes, trying to clear away the fatigue. The last few days had been one endless cycle code: coffee, sleeplessness, doubt. He could still see her face when she'd come home at dawn, the shadows under her eyes, the tense shoulders, the noncommittal gaze. Her "I'm just tired" had been a broken record, and he couldn't pretend to believe it anymore. He had to know, even if the truth was what he feared. He clicked on a link to a compact camera with Wi-Fi and night vision. "As invisible as a shadow," the ad said. Michael almost chuckled. A shadow was what he had become in his own life. He placed an order for next-day delivery and closed his laptop, feeling like he had signed a contract with the devil. This wasn't just a device. This was a step he couldn't take back. The camera arrived in a nondescript cardboard box, without any identifying marks, as if the courier knew he was handing over not just a gadget, but a Pandora's box. Michael unpacked it in the dim hallway while Emily was on her next shift. Small, no bigger than a matchbox with a matte black body, it seemed harmless, but in his hands it felt like a weapon. The instructions promised easy installation, and he managed it in half an hour, securing the device to a shelf among the old books and trinkets that he and Emily had collected in the early years of their marriage. The camera faced the front door, its tiny lens almost invisible, hidden between the spine of a tattered volume of Dostoevsky and a souvenir figurine of the Eiffel Tower bought during their honeymoon in Paris. Then they laughed, planned the future, and drank cheap wine from plastic cups. Now this statue was just a decoration for his paranoia. He connected the camera to his phone via the app and checked the feed. The image was clear, even in the dim light of the hallway. The door, the coat rack, the piece of carpet, it all looked ordinary, but the sight of it made his mouth go dry. He turned off the app and shoved the phone in his pocket, feeling like a traitor. But a traitor to whom? Emily? Himself? Their marriage? He didn't know. All he knew was that he couldn't live in ignorance any longer. Emily came home around midnight, her footsteps light, almost inaudible, in the hallway. Michael was lying in the bedroom, pretending to sleep, but his heart was pounding like he'd run a marathon. He heard her throw her bag on the floor, the jingle of her keys, the rustle of her jacket. Then silence, broken only by the sound of her footsteps in the bathroom as she turned on the water. He waited until she lay down, until her breathing was even, before he pulled out his phone. His fingers shook as he opened the camera app. The recording began automatically as soon as the motion sensor detected her arrival. Emily appeared on the screen, but it wasn't the Emily he was used to. Her medical scrubs had been replaced by a black dress, form-fitting, with a low neckline he'd never seen before. Her hair, usually pulled back into a practical ponytail, was loose, falling in waves over her shoulders. Her makeup was heavy, with dark eyeliner and red lipstick that made her lips almost provocative. She looked like a woman who wasn't going to work at the hospital, but rather on a date. Or worse. Michael rewound the footage to the moment she left the house. The camera had caught her exit in the same dress, but underneath it was something else: lace lingerie, black, with thin straps, expensive, not what she usually wore. His stomach clenched. He didn't remember her buying anything like this. He didn't remember her even caring about such things in years. Their sex life had long since degenerated into rare, almost mechanical moments when they were both too tired to put their hearts into it. But this was different. This was for someone else. He scrolled through the footage to other days. The camera worked fine, recording her exits and returns. Each time, the same scenario. Expensive lingerie, heavy makeup, dresses he'd never seen before. Sometimes she'd talk into the phone, her voice muffled but her words clear. "Yes, I'll be there soon, just after midnight." She smiled as she said it, but it wasn't her usual smile, not the one he knew. It was a smile that held something predatory, something he'd never seen in her before. Michael turned off the phone, feeling the blood pounding in his temples. He lay in the dark, listening to her breathing next to him, and for the first time in their marriage, he felt like he was sharing a bed with a stranger. His mind raced between anger and despair, trying to find an explanation that wouldn't break his heart. Was she just tired of their routine? Was this her way of coping with the pressure, the endless bills, his sullen silence? But the lacy lingerie, those words on the phone, they didn't fit the picture of a tired nurse seeking comfort. The next night he found himself back at the Black Cat, sitting on the same stool, the same glass of whiskey in his hand. Lou, the bartender, gave him a look of tired sympathy. "You look like you've been run over by a truck, buddy," he said, pouring another drink. "That's right," Michael muttered, without looking up. Vivian appeared as if on cue, her musky scent cutting through the smoky air once more. She was wearing a different dress today, a red one with a slit that drew the eye like a magnet. She ordered her gin and tonic and turned to him, her lips curling into a familiar, mocking smile. "You again, Michael. Is life still beating you over the head?" He chuckled, but there was no humor in the sound. "You could say that." She narrowed her eyes, studying him like a predator assessing its prey. "You know, you look like someone who just found the answer and didn't like it." Michael took a sip, letting the whiskey burn his throat. He didn't want to say it, but the words were coming. "I set up a camera," he said quietly, almost a whisper, as if he were afraid someone in the bar would hear, "in the hallway, to see where she went." Vivian wasn't surprised. Her eyebrows lifted slightly, but there was no judgment in her eyes, only curiosity. "And what did you see?" He swallowed, feeling the words scrape against his throat. "She doesn't go to shifts. She leaves in dresses, in lingerie I've never seen, talking on the phone, smiling in a way she never smiles at me." Vivian leaned closer, her voice softer, but still with that same sharp edge. "What are you going to do now, Michael? Go after her, ask her straight out, or sit here and drown the truth in whiskey?" He didn't answer, not because he didn't want to, but because he didn't know. His mind was like a code with a bug, spinning in an endless loop, unable to find a way out. He could follow Emily, find out where she goes, who she dates. But what if he sees something he can't forget? What if the truth is worse than his worst fantasies? You know, Vivian said, leaning back in her chair, the truth is like a knife. It cuts cleanly, but it leaves scars. The question is, are you ready for those scars? Michael looked at her red lips, at her eyes that seemed to see everything he was trying to hide. What about you? Have you ever sought the truth, knowing it would destroy you? She laughed, but there was no joy in her laughter. Oh, Michael, I live in this city. Here, truth is currency. And believe me, I've paid my price. Back at the house, Michael checked the camera again. Emily had left around 8, wearing a different dress, a navy blue one with a low back that seemed almost indecent. Her makeup was flawless, her lips glossy, as if she were getting ready for something important. He rewound to the phone call the camera had caught before she left. Yeah, I'll be there soon. Just after midnight, she said, her voice soft, almost intimate. She smiled, adjusting her hair in the hallway mirror, and Michael felt his heart clench. That smile wasn't for him. He closed the app and stared at the ceiling. Questions swarmed in his head, but the answers seemed too heavy to lift. Who was she? What was she hiding? And why couldn't he, a man who could find errors in thousands of lines of code, solve the riddle of his own wife? He knew the next step was inevitable. He couldn't just watch the tapes, sit in the bar, and brood. He had to act. He had to follow her, find out where she went, who she talked to. But the thought filled him with dread, not just because of what he might find, but because of who he would become if he did. A husband who spied on his wife, a man who didn't trust. But there was no choice. The truth, as Vivian had said, was a knife, and he was already holding it. The Chicago night was thick as ink on the streets, and the rain had finally let up, leaving only a wet sheen on the asphalt and a damp smell. Michael sat in his old Ford, parked across the street from their house, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. The engine hummed softly, and the wipers lazily swept the last of the moisture off the windshield. He felt like a character in a pulp detective story, trapped in his own life, and the thought made him sick. But he couldn't stop. Not when the security footage showed him an Emily who wasn't the Emily he knew. The black lace lingerie, the heavy makeup, her voice on the phone, not until midnight. It was all like a code he couldn't decipher, but he knew it led to something dark. Emily left her apartment at 9:37 p.m. The hallway camera alerted his phone, and without thinking, he slipped out of the apartment, leaving the lights off so as not to give away his departure. She was wearing a dark green dress that hugged her figure, with a slit that exposed her thigh with every step. Her hair, usually tied back casually, flowed over her shoulders, and her heels clicked on the sidewalk with a confidence he hadn't seen in her in years. She got into a cab, and Michael held his breath as he started the car, keeping a safe distance away. His heart was pounding like a drum, and his mind was spinning with one thought. Where are you going, Em? The cab wound through the streets, past the neon signs of bars and all-night eateries, until it pulled up in front of the Mirage Hotel, a place Michael knew only by hearsay. It was more than a hotel, a fortress of luxury, hidden behind plate glass and suited security guards. Its tall towers loomed over the center of town, their lights reflecting in the puddles like fallen stars. Michael parked in the shadows of an alley, his car looking forlorn among the sleek limos lined up outside. He watched Emily step out of the cab, her movements fluid, almost theatrical. She adjusted her dress, glanced at her phone, and walked toward the entrance, where a uniformed doorman opened the glass doors for her as if she were a queen. Michael felt his throat tighten. The Mirage was not a place where nurses went after their shifts. It was the world of the rich, a world of private parties and deals that were not spoken of out loud. He wanted to run out of the car, rush inside, grab her hand, and demand an explanation. But he stayed where he was, his fingers shaking, and in his head he heard Vivian's voice from the Black Cat. Truth is a knife. Are you ready for the scars? He waited. An hour, 2, 3. The lights in the Mirage flickered like distant lighthouses, and his mind conjured up images that made him want to smash the windshield. Emily with someone else in a hotel room. Emily laughed like she had in those security footage. Emily who was no longer his. He turned on his phone to distract himself, but instead he opened his browser and started searching. At first, without purpose, just to keep his hands busy, but soon his fingers typed the query, Chicago Sex Services. He didn't know why he had that idea. Maybe it was her dresses, her lingerie, the way she looked as she walked away into the night. But as soon as he hit search, his world began to crumble. There were dozens of sites, from cheap ones with flashy banners to high-end ones with minimalist designs and passwords to enter. One caught his eye, a dark-toned site called Velvet Night that promised exclusive encounters for a select few. Michael clicked on the link and was asked to register. He used a fake email he'd created in a minute and was given access to a gallery of profiles. Women, men, couples, all with blurred faces and screen names that sounded like names from old movies. He scrolled down, his heart pounding, until he landed on one. Lilith. The photo was dark, but the silhouette was familiar. Dark hair, a slender figure, a dress he'd seen on camera. The description was short, but each word was etched into his brain like a shard of glass. Sparks passion, sophistication, and mystery. Available for meetings after midnight, only for those who know what they want. Michael zoomed in, trying to make out the face, but it was hidden in shadow, and yet he knew it was her. Emily. Hi, Emily. Or maybe not his anymore. He threw the phone onto the passenger seat, his breathing heavy as if the air in the car had thickened. This couldn't be true. Not his Emily, who cried over romantic comedies, who made him coffee in the morning, who promised to be with him through thick and thin. But the evidence was there, the camera, her nightly departures, the mirage, that damn profile. He wanted to scream, to smash something, but instead he just sat there, staring at the hotel lights that now seemed like a mockery. When Emily left the Mirage at 3 in the morning, Michael was still there, his eyes bloodshot from fatigue and the whiskey he'd grabbed from home. She looked much the same as she had when she'd walked in, except her hair was a little disheveled and her lipstick was rubbed off. She paused at the entrance, checking her phone, and again the same gesture adjusting her dress, smiling into space. The cab pulled up, and she drove away, leaving him alone with his thoughts. He didn't follow her. Instead, he went back to his phone, opened the Velvet Night website, and dug deeper. Lilith's profile was active, with reviews that made his stomach churn. An unforgettable night, sparks flew, pure magic, words written by anonymous users who apparently knew his wife better than he did. He found the scheduling section. Available by appointment, meetings after midnight. It was the same thing she'd said on the phone. The same thing he'd heard on the camera footage. Michael closed the browser and sat back, feeling the world crumble around him. He didn't know what to do next. Confront her? That would mean admitting that he'd been spying, that he'd seen her profile, that he knew. Leave? But where? Their lives were intertwined, a mortgage, memories, 10 years that couldn't be erased. He could pretend he'd seen nothing, but that thought was the worst of all. Living with a lie while knowing the truth would be a slow death. He returned to the Black Cat the following evening, as if the bar had become his refuge, a place to escape reality. Lou, the bartender, no longer asked questions, simply poured a whiskey and went to serve another customer. Vivian, as always, appeared out of nowhere, her red dress replaced by a black one, with a plunging neckline that made the men behind the bar turn their heads. She sat down next to him, her eyes immediately catching his tension. "Well, Michael," she said, her voice soft but with her usual mockery. "You look like you've seen a ghost. Have you found your truth?" He took a long swig of whiskey, feeling the alcohol burn his throat. "I went after her," he said, his voice hoarse. "She was at a hotel, the Mirage, a fancy place, not for the likes of us. And then I found her profile on a website, sex services." Vivian didn't blink. She just stared at him, her eyes like mirrors reflecting his own pain. "Lilith, huh?" she asked, and Michael froze. "How do you know?" His voice trembled, his fingers squeezing the glass so hard that it almost cracked. She shrugged, her smile almost sympathetic. "Chicago's a small town, Michael, if you know where to look. Velvet Night isn't such a secret place, and Lilith, she's a star there. He felt the ground slipping out from under his feet. Do you know her? Not personally, Vivian said, sipping her gin and tonic. But I know this world. Girls like her, they don't just get there. It's not about money, not always. Sometimes it's about control, about power, about feeling alive. The question is, what are you going to do now? Michael didn't answer. He didn't know. His mind was a cracked screen fragments of thoughts, images, memories, all jumbled into chaos. Emily in their bedroom, laughing at his jokes. Emily in the mirage, walking through doors that led to another world. Emily as Lilith, the woman he didn't know. I can't just leave it like this, he said finally, his voice almost a whisper. But I don't know how to live with it. Vivian leaned closer, her hand brushing his wrist, sending a chill down his skin. You've gone too far, Michael. There's no turning back. You either follow through or you let this eat you up inside. The choice is yours. She stood up, leaving him alone with his whiskey and thoughts that were heavier than he could bear. Michael looked at the empty glass, at the reflection of the neon lights in the puddle on the counter, and knew she was right. He couldn't stop. Not now that he knew who his wife was behind the window dressing of her lies. It was that murky time of day before dawn in Chicago, when the city seemed like a ghost of itself, the streets empty, the lights dimming, the shadows clinging to the corners of buildings as if they didn't want to let go of the night. Michael sat in his car, parked in a dark alley not far from his house, his fingers fiddling nervously with the pack of cigarettes he'd bought for the first time in a decade. He didn't smoke, but he needed to hold something in his hands, or he might smash the steering wheel or his knuckles. His mind was an overloaded server, ready to crash from the flood of data. Emily on Mirage, her profile on Velvet Night, the name Lilith that made fun of their marriage. He knew too much, but it wasn't enough. He needed the whole picture, every detail, even if it crushed him. Lilith's profile was just the beginning. The reviews, the meeting schedule, the smile on her camera footage, it all pointed to a life he had no idea about. But who were these people she was dating? What did they mean to her? And why had she chosen this path? The answers, if they existed at all, were hidden somewhere in her world, and Michael knew he wouldn't find them by simply following her through the night. He needed to dig deeper, to where she kept her secrets. Her laptop, an old MacBook that she always kept password protected, was his next target. Michael wasn't a hacker, but years of working with code had taught him how to understand systems, find vulnerabilities, and bypass defenses. But breaking into someone else's computer, especially his wife's, was beyond his skill set. He needed someone who didn't ask too many questions, who knew the dark corners of the digital world. And he knew just the man. Danny, an old college friend who now made his living walking the line on the law. Danny was the kind of guy who could hack into anything from bank accounts to security cameras, and yet still managed to look like a harmless techie with caffeine in his veins. Michael dialed his number from his car as the city slowly woke up around him. Danny answered on the third ring, his voice hoarse from lack of sleep. Mike? Shit, do you know what time it is? 5 a.m, man. I need your help, Michael said, trying to keep his voice level even as he seethed inside. It's personal. Danny chuckled, and Michael could almost see him rubbing his eyes, sitting in his cluttered apartment, surrounded by computer screens and empty energy drink cans. Personal, huh? This is about your wife, right? I told you she was weird when you brought her along in college. Don't start, Michael snapped. Can you hack a laptop, MacBook, new password? I don't know what it is. There was a pause on the other end of the line, and then Danny laughed, but it wasn't a joyful laugh. Are you serious? You want to spy on Emily? Dude, that's a dark path. Are you going to help or not? Michael squeezed the phone so hard the plastic creaked. Danny sighed. Okay, come, but if it blows up in your face, don't blame me. Danny's apartment was in a neighborhood that smelled of cheap beer and desperation, even at 5 a.m. The building was old, with peeling paint and stairs that creaked as if complaining with every step. Danny answered the door in a wrinkled t-shirt with the logo of some forgotten rock band, his hair sticking up in all directions, his eyes red from sleepless nights. "Come in, spy," he said, stepping aside. The room was a sanctuary of chaos. Wires snaked across the floor, monitors blinked green lines of code, and a half-empty bottle of whiskey sat on the table. Danny plopped down in a chair that looked like it had survived a nuclear apocalypse and gestured toward Emily's laptop, which Michael had brought with him, nicking it from their bedroom while she was in the shower. "So," Danny began, plugging his MacBook into his equipment, "what are we looking for? Love letters? Porn? Or do you just want to know how much she spends on coffee?" Michael didn't answer, his gaze glued to the screen where Danny was already running some programs with an interface that looked like something out of a sci-fi movie. "Just hack it," he said finally. "I'll figure it out myself." Danny shrugged and got to work. His fingers flew across the keyboard, and the screen filled with lines of code Michael only partially understood. Half an hour later, after a few failed attempts and a few curses, Danny sat back in his chair. "Done. Password reset. This is your Pandora's box now, buddy. Want me to dig for you?" "No," Michael snapped, feeling his heart squeeze. "I'll do it myself." He sat down at his laptop, the screen now glowing invitingly with Emily's desktop. Folders, files, a few photos from their old vacations, it all looked deceptively normal. But he knew what he was looking for. He opened his browser, checked his history. Nothing out of the ordinary, medical sites, recipes, online stores. But then he noticed an encrypted folder, hidden deep within the system, innocently titled Work Documents. His fingers paused over the keyboard. This was it. He could feel it. Danny, watching from across the room, chuckled. "Secure, huh? Let me do that." He plugged in a flash drive with some of his software, and 10 minutes later the folder opened. Inside was a list and Excel file with names, dates, addresses. Michael clicked on it, and his breathing stopped. A client list. Dozens of names, some initial, some with full details. Next to each, amounts, dates, locations. The Mirage, the Drake, private clubs Michael had only heard of. But the names, they were a punch to the gut. Senator James R. Crow, known for his speeches about family values. Real estate mogul Carl Wayland, whose face was regularly in the news. Judge Elizabeth Thorne, a no-nonsense woman who was rumored to take no bribes. And dozens more businessmen, lawyers, people whose names mean power and money. Emily, his Emily, dated them, under the pseudonym Lilith. Michael scrolled through the list, his eyes bright and his throat tight. But one name stood out, Mr. D. It was repeated more than any other, with notes about special meetings and amounts that made him choke. Next to that name was a separate folder, protected by another password. Danny, without being asked, reconnected, his fingers dancing over the keys until the folder opened. Photos, videos, dossiers. The photos showed Emily, or rather, Lilith in luxurious suites, wearing the lingerie he'd seen on camera, holding a glass of wine, her smile the same one he'd seen in Mirage. The videos were short, but each one was a knife in the heart. Her voice, her laugh, her movements, all for someone else. The dossier contained information about Mr. D, not her full name, but enough. Age around 50, profession unspecified but labeled high access, preferences detailed, too detailed, even recordings of phone calls where her voice sounded like something he hadn't heard in years, soft, seductive, full of life. "Shit, Mike," Danny muttered, looking over his shoulder. "This is serious. Are you sure you want to dig any further?" Michael didn't answer. He couldn't. His world was crumbling, and every click of the files was like a hammer blow. He closed the laptop, his hand shaking. "Thank you," he managed, standing up. "I'll figure it out." Danny shook his head. "You won't figure this out, buddy. This isn't code you can debug. This is her life, and now it's yours too." Michael returned home to the gray of dawn. Emily was still missing another shift, another lie. He sat in his chair, his laptop lying on the coffee table like a ticking time bomb. He didn't know what to do with what he'd found. Confront her. That would mean revealing that he'd hacked her laptop, that he'd seen her as Lilith, that he knew about the senator, the tycoon, the judge, and the mysterious Mr. D. Leave. But where? Their lives had been bound not just by love, but by duty, by obligation, by memories that still clung to him like shadows. He found himself back at the Black Cat that evening, his retreat almost a ritual. Lou poured the whiskey without a word, his face weary with understanding. Vivian appeared as usual, her black dress replaced by a maroon one with an eye-catching neckline, but her eyes were fixed on Michael. She sat down next to him, her musky scent mingling with the smell of cigarette smoke. "You look worse than usual," she said, her voice soft but with the usual sharp edge. "Found something new, huh?" Michael took a sip, feeling the whiskey burn in his throat. "I hacked into her laptop," he said, his voice hoarse. "A list of clients, a senator, a mogul, a judge, and someone named Mr. D. He has photos, videos, dossiers. She keeps all of it like it's her job." Vivian wasn't surprised. She just nodded, her eyes studying him as if she already knew the end of this story. "Mr. D, you say? This isn't just any client, Michael. If she's building a dossier on him, it means she's playing a dangerous game. People like that, they don't like their secrets becoming someone else's property." "Do you know who he is?" he asked, his voice shaking. She shrugged, her smile cold. "Maybe I do, maybe I don't. But I do know that people like him don't just pay for a night. They buy silence, control, power. And your Emily, or Lilith, she seems to know how it works." Michael gripped the glass, his fingers white. "Why? Why is she doing this? We've had problems, but not to this extent." Vivian leaned closer, her voice almost a whisper. "Maybe it's not about you, Michael. Maybe it's about her, about what she was missing, about who she wanted to be. You've seen her in this world. She's not just a nurse who pulls through shifts. She's Lilith, and Lilith knows what she wants." He looked at her, her words like poison, slowly seeping into his blood. He wanted to argue, to say that Emily was different, that she was still his wife, that this was all a mistake. But he couldn't. The photos, the videos, the client list, it was all more real than his memories of her. "What should I do?" he asked, his voice almost pleading. Vivian leaned back in her chair, her eyes glittering in the dim light of the bar. "You're in this already, Michael. You can walk away and pretend you didn't see anything. Or you can go further, find out who Mr. D is, what she wants from him. But be prepared, the truth doesn't just cut, it kills." She stood up, leaving him alone with his whiskey and thoughts that were like shards of a broken mirror. Michael looked at the neon lights outside the window, at the reflection of his face in the glass, and knew he had no choice. He had already gone too far. And now that he knew about Mr. D, about her secrets, he couldn't stop. Not when the truth was so close and so deadly. The darkness in Chicago wasn't just the absence of light. It was a tangible thing, like the smoke that clung to the streets, permeating everything with the smell of damp and asphalt. Michael sat in his apartment, in the same battered chair that had become his personal torture chamber. Emily's laptop lay in front of him, the screen still bearing the marks of his latest intrusion into her privacy. The client list, the photos, the videos, the dossier on Mr. D, it was all a mine waiting to explode, and he held it in his hands, unsure how to defuse it. His mind was an overloaded program, fixated on a mistake he couldn't fix. Emily, his Emily, wasn't just an unfaithful wife. She was Lilith, a woman who played with fire, and that fire could burn them both. He hadn't slept in 2 days, his eyes were burning with fatigue, and the whiskey he'd been drinking at the Black Cat had only added to the pounding in his head. The names on her list, the senator, the tycoon, the judge, swirled around in his mind, but Mr. D was a black hole, sucking everything else in. Who was he? Why had Emily kept such a detailed file on him? And why did her voice on the recording sound as if she was enjoying the part rather than just acting it out? Michael felt like an outsider in his own life, a man who'd stumbled into someone else's story and now didn't know how to get out of it. He decided he couldn't just sit and watch anymore. He needed to figure out what was going on, even if it meant digging deeper into her secrets. He opened his laptop again, going back to the folder with a file on Mr. D. It wasn't just photos and videos, there were text messages, encrypted files Danny hadn't had time to crack, and notes in her handwriting. One of them read, "Mr. D is the key. If he doesn't agree, it's Plan B." Plan B? What did that mean? Michael felt his heart clench. This wasn't just about sex. This was something more, something dangerous. He began digging through the messages he had managed to decipher. The messages were short, but their tone was far from what he had expected. Emily wasn't just arranging meetings, she was dictating terms. "If you want the tapes to remain secret, you might want to reconsider your offer," she wrote in one message to Mr. D. "I know who you are, and I know what you have to lose if this gets out." Blackmail. His wife, a nurse who had once cried over love movies, was blackmailing a man whose power could crush her with a single move. Michael leaned back in his chair, breathing hard. This wasn't just cheating. It was a gamble, with her life at stake, and perhaps his too. Emily came home at 2 in the morning, her footsteps in the hallway as light as ever. But now Michael heard something different in them, not tiredness, but calculation. He sat in the dark, his laptop closed, but its light still reflected in his eyes, a reminder of what he had seen. She walked into the living room without turning on the light, her silhouette barely visible in the dim light. She looked the same as always, medical scrubs, hair in a loose ponytail, but now he knew it was a mask. Underneath was Lilith, the woman who blackmailed men whose names meant more than their marriages. "You're awake," she said, her voice calm but wary. She paused in the doorway, her eyes sliding over him, assessing. "I can't," he replied, his voice hoarse, as if the words were scraping his throat. "I think too much." She nodded, dropping her bag on the couch and heading toward the kitchen, but Michael stopped her. "Emily," he said, standing up. His voice was shaking, but he couldn't keep quiet any longer. "I know. About Velvet Night. About Lilith. About Mr. D." She froze, her hand frozen on the refrigerator handle. The moment of silence was so heavy that Michael could almost hear it pressing against the walls. He waited for her to scream, to cry, to make excuses. But instead she turned, her eyes meeting his, and there was no anger or fear in them. Only weariness, deep as an abyss. "You have no idea what I've gotten myself into," she said quietly, her voice barely a whisper, but there was steel in it. She walked toward him, her movements slow but sure. "You think this is just cheating? That I'm just sleeping with someone for money? Michael, it's not that simple." He looked at her, his mind refusing to accept her words. "Then explain," he said, his voice breaking. "Explain why you blackmail people. Why do you have a file on some Mr. D? Why do you live this other life?" Emily sighed, her shoulders slumping as if she were carrying a weight that had finally become too heavy. She sat down on the couch, her hands in her lap, her fingers fiddling nervously with the hem of her uniform. "I didn't want you to know. Not like this. But now that you know, I'll tell you. Just don't think it'll change anything between us." Michael sat down across from her, his heart pounding, but he forced himself to listen. She began to speak, her voice even, almost businesslike, as if she were reciting a report. "It started 2 years ago. I was at my wit's end. Working at the hospital, it was draining me. The endless shifts, the screaming patients, the bills we couldn't pay. You were busy with your codes, your deadlines, and I didn't blame you, but I felt invisible. And then one of the nurses, a friend, told me about Velvet Night. At first, I thought it was just a way to make money. But then I realized it was more. It was power. These people, the senators, the moguls, the judges, they weren't just paying for the night. They were paying for silence, for control. And I learned to play the game." Michael felt his throat tighten. "And Mr. D?" he asked, his voice barely audible. Emily looked at him, her eyes darkening. "Mr. D isn't just a client. He's dangerous. He has connections that are enough to destroy anyone. I found out more about him than he wanted, and now I have something that can break him. Videos, recordings, documents. If I release this, his career, his life, everything will fall apart." "You're blackmailing him," Michael said, his words an accusation but lacking in force. He was too stunned. "Yes," she said, not looking away. "And he knows. He offered me money, a lot of money, to keep me quiet. But I want more. Not just money. I want him to pay for what he did. Not just to me, but to others." Others? Michael frowned, his mind trying to process the meaning of her words. Emily nodded. "I'm not the only one, Michael. There are other girls, other lives he's ruined. I didn't just build a dossier on him for the money. It's revenge and insurance." He looked at her, trying to see the Emily he knew, but this was a different woman, cold, calculating, with eyes that burned with determination. He wanted to hate her, but instead he felt only emptiness. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked finally. "We could have. I don't know. We worked through this together." She smiled bitterly. "Cope? Michael, you live in your own world codes, deadlines, your little bubble. You didn't notice me disappearing, drowning. It's not your fault, but I couldn't tell you. You wouldn't understand." Her words were like a slap in the face, but he knew she was right. He hadn't noticed. He hadn't seen her drift away, her smiles grow less frequent, their marriage became routine. But that didn't excuse her. It didn't excuse the blackmail, the lies, the double life. "What now?" he asked, his voice hoarse. "You're just going to continue, and I'm supposed to pretend I don't know." Emily looked at him, her eyes full of something he couldn't quite place: regret, maybe, or weariness. "I don't know, Michael. I don't know what's going to happen next. But Mr. D, he's not the type to give up. If he finds out you've been going through my files, it's going to be dangerous. For both of us." Michael couldn't stay home after that conversation. He left without a word and found himself back at the Black Cat, where the neon lights and the smell of whiskey were the only things that felt familiar. Lou, the bartender, poured him a double without a word, his eyes saying he'd seen Michael's like too many times. Vivian appeared as usual, her burgundy dress replaced by a black one with gold threads that shimmered in the dim light. She sat down next to him, her eyes immediately registering his state. "You look like your world has ended," she said, her voice soft but with its usual sharp edge. "What's wrong, Michael? Uncovering something new?" He took a sip, feeling the whiskey burn in his throat. "She's blackmailing him," he said quietly, his voice shaking. "Mr. D, she's got a file on him, threatening to leak it. This isn't just sex work. She's playing some kind of game, and I don't know who she is." Vivian wasn't surprised. She just nodded, her eyes glittering as if she already knew this part of the story. "Blackmail, huh? Your Emily is a brave girl. Or stupid. The likes of Mr. D don't like being put in a corner. They hit back, and they hit hard." She said it wasn't just about her, Michael continued, his fingers tightening around the glass. That he'd ruined other lives, that she wanted revenge. Vivian leaned closer, her voice almost a whisper. "Revenge is a dangerous thing, Michael. It's addictive, like a drug. But if she goes after someone like that, she's not just Lilith. She's a target. And you too, if you're around." He looked at her, her words like a cold wind, cutting into his bones. "She knows I know," he said. "And she's not mad." She said, "I have no idea what she's gotten herself into." Vivian chuckled, but there was no warmth in her smile. "Oh, Michael, she's right. You have no idea. But you're in it now. The question is, do you want to stay in the game or run while you still can?" He didn't answer. He didn't know. His mind was a maze, with every turn leading to a new nightmare. Emily blackmailing the man whose power could destroy them. Emily, who was no longer his wife, but someone else, someone who played by rules he didn't understand. And he, the man who had spied, hacked, betrayed, to learn the truth that now threatened to destroy them both. Michael finished his whiskey, feeling his world shrink to the point where there was no turning back. He knew he had to make a choice: walk away, leave her with her secrets, or move on, find out who Mr. D was, and try to get her out of this game. But each choice was like stepping into an abyss, and he didn't know if he had the strength to survive the fall. The Chicago streets were cold, their damp gleam reflecting the neon signs that flashed like warnings, but Michael no longer noticed them. His world had narrowed to his apartment, where the air was thick with tension, like before a thunderstorm. The conversation with Emily, her confession about Mr. D's blackmail, her words, "You have no idea what I've gotten myself into," all of it was like poison, slowly poisoning his blood. He returned home after the Black Cat, where Vivian, as always, left him with questions he couldn't answer. His mind was a cracked screen showing fragments of their lives. Her smile 10 years ago, her silhouette in the doorway of the Mirage, her voice on recordings promising someone a night after midnight. He didn't know how to live with this knowledge, but he knew he couldn't just walk away. Emily was home when he walked in. She was sitting on the couch, her scrubs replaced by a black silk shirt that barely covered her hips. Her hair was down, dark waves falling over her shoulders, and she held a glass of wine, red as blood. The light from the desk lamp cast shadows on her face, making her look both familiar and alien. She looked at him, her eyes calm, but there was something new in them, a challenge, perhaps, or weariness from the masks she wore. "You're late," she said, her voice soft but with a sharp edge, like a blade hidden in velvet. She set her glass down and stood, her movements fluid, almost cat-like. Michael felt his pulse quicken despite the anger that still simmered in his chest. "I was at the bar," he replied, his voice hoarse, as if the words were stuck in his throat. "Thinking." She stepped closer, her bare feet making no sound on the worn carpet. "About what? About me? About Lilith? Or about how far you're willing to go to find out the truth?" Her words were like a blow, but there was truth in them. He looked at her lips slightly parted, at her eyes that seemed to see right through him. He wanted to hate her, wanted to scream, but instead he felt his body reacting to her closeness, to her scent, the same floral scent with a hint of citrus mixed with something new, heavy like musk. This was not the Emily he knew. This was Lilith, and she was standing before him, not hiding. "Why are you doing this?" he asked, his voice shaking with a mixture of anger and desire. "Why can't you just stop?" She smiled, but her smile was bitter, almost painful. "Stop. Michael, do you think it's that easy? This world, it's addictive. It gives you power you've never had. Do you think I can just go back to the hospital shifts, to our bills, to our life that was suffocating me?" He took a step toward her, his hands clenched into fists. "You choked me too, Emily. You lied. You blackmail people. You're not who I thought you were." Her eyes flashed, and she stepped closer, so close he could feel the heat of her body. "And you? You spied on me, hacked into my laptop, followed me like some kind of detective. You're not who I thought you were either." Michael wanted to answer, but the words stuck. She was right, and it burned worse than the whiskey. He looked at her face that was both familiar and foreign, and he felt the anger mingle with something else, hunger, desperation, the desire to have her back, even if she was no longer his. He grabbed her wrists, his fingers squeezing her skin, not hard, but enough for her to feel. "You ruined us," he said, his voice almost a growl. Emily didn't pull away. Instead, she leaned closer, her lips almost touching his. "You too," she whispered, her voice a mixture of pain and defiance. The moment stretched out like a string about to snap. And then he kissed her, not gently, not like before, but hungrily, with the fury that had been building inside him since he'd seen her profile on Velvet Night. She responded with the same passion, her hands clutching at his shirt, crumpling the material, her nails digging into his shoulders. This wasn't love. This was war, angry, painful, desperate. They collapsed on the couch, their movements abrupt, almost cruel, as if each was trying to prove something to the other. Her shirt slipped off, revealing the lacy lingerie he'd seen on camera, and it only added fuel to the fire. He hated her for it, but his body wouldn't listen, obeying an ancient, primal instinct. Her breath was hot, her lips whispering his name, but there was none of the softness in her voice he remembered. This was Lilith, a woman who knew what she wanted and took it without hesitation. She pulled him close, her fingers unbuckling his belt with a confidence that both thrilled and terrified him. Their bodies were entwined, skin to skin, but there was pain in every movement, not physical pain, but pain born of the knowledge that they were no longer who they had been. He looked into her eyes, and there was no Emily there, the one who had laughed at his jokes, the one who had slept beside him, trustingly pressed against her. This woman was different, strong, calculating, dangerous, and he couldn't tear himself away from her, even knowing it. When it was over, they lay in silence, their breathing the only sound in the room. Michael stared at the ceiling, his chest heaving, his mind a mess. He knew she was forever changed. The Emily he loved was gone, lost in Lilith, and this new woman was both alluring and terrifying. He turned to face her, her face calm, but her eyes still blazing with the same challenge. "You're not coming back," he said, his voice hoarse, almost broken. "You're not my Emily anymore." She looked at him, her lips slightly curved into a smile, but there was no warmth in it. "I was never just yours, Michael. But you can be a part of this, my game." He frowned, his mind trying to process her words. "What are you talking about?" Emily sat up, her hair falling around her face like a curtain, hiding her thoughts. "You know who they are. The senator, the tycoon, the judge, Mr. D. I have everything on them, records, documents, their secrets. I can destroy them. But I don't want to do it alone. You're smart, Michael. You know how to find weaknesses, how to break systems. We could work together, blackmail them, take what they owe us." He looked at her, his mind refusing to accept her words. "Are you serious? You want me to, what, become your accomplice, so that we can blackmail these people together?" She leaned closer, her hand brushing his chest, her fingers cold. "This isn't just blackmail, Michael. This is justice. These men use their power to destroy lives. I've seen what they've done to other girls, to people who couldn't fight back. We can stop them. And yes, make money off of it. More than you can imagine." Her words were like poison, sweet and deadly. He saw a fire in her eyes that hadn't been there before, and he knew she meant it. She was asking him not just to enter her world, but to be part of it, part of this dark, dangerous game where the rules were written in blood and secrets. He wanted to reject her, to tell her that he was not like that he could not become someone who blackmailed the elite, who lived a lie. But a part of him, the part that still felt her touch, her heat, wanted to agree, wanted to be with her, even if it meant losing himself. "You don't understand what you're asking me to get into," he said finally, his voice quiet but steely. "This isn't just a game, Emily. This is the end. For us, for everything." She looked at him, her eyes like mirrors, reflecting his own fear. "Maybe our end has already come, Michael. The question is, what will you choose next? In a world where betrayal is the norm, we choose to be different. We show those who did not cheat, who did not sell, who remained faithful to himself, his country, his principles. If you are one of them, this channel is for you. Subscription is your support. Like is your sign. I'm with you." He went to the Black Cat that night, as if the bar was the only place he could breathe. Lou poured the whiskey without a word, his face a mask that had seen too many of these stories. Vivian appeared as usual, her black dress with gold threads replaced by a navy blue one with a slit that drew the eye, but her eyes were fixed on Michael. She sat down next to him, her musky scent mingling with the smell of cigarette smoke. "You look like someone who just sold their soul," she said, her voice soft but with the usual sharp edge. "What did she do to you this time?" Michael took a sip, feeling the whiskey burn in his throat. She wants me to join her," he said, his voice shaking. "Blackmail them. The senator, the tycoon, Mr. D. She says it's fair, that we can take what they owe us." Vivian narrowed her eyes glittering as if she could see the end of this story. "Oh, Michael, she's playing for high stakes, and she wants you to be her partner. That's not just dangerous, that's suicide." "I know," he said, his fingers tightening around the glass. "But I don't know how to leave. She's not who she was. But I still feel her." Vivian leaned closer, her voice almost a whisper. "You love her, Michael. But love won't save you from what she's dragging you into. These people, they're not just clients. They're sharks. And if you enter their waters, they'll eat you both. He looked at her, her words like cold water, sobering but not answering. He knew Vivian was right. But he also knew Emily or Lilith wouldn't let him go now. She'd drawn him into her game, and he was part of it now, whether he wanted to be or not. The only question was how far he was willing to go and whether he could keep himself if he chose to play by her rules. Michael finished his whiskey, his gaze falling on the neon lights outside the window, on the reflection of his face, which was no longer what he knew. He knew he was standing on the edge, and the next step would determine everything. Enter the game with Emily, become her accomplice, dive into this world of lies and blackmail. Or walk away, leave her, try to save himself. But how to walk away from the woman who still held his heart, even if it was broken? Chicago was a city that never slept, but in the small hours it was a lurking beast, its streets whispering secrets hidden in the shadows. Michael stood at their apartment window, his fingers tapping nervously against the cold glass, his mind a whirlwind of doubts, fears, and her words. We can take what they owe us. Emily or Lilith, as he sometimes thought of her now, was asleep in the bedroom, her breathing the only sound in the silence, but even that sound seemed alien to him. After their last night, full of fierce passion and bitter truth, he felt on the edge of an abyss. She had invited him to join her game, to blackmail the elite, to use her dossier to wrest money and power from those who were destroying lives. And despite his inner protests, he knew he had already taken a step toward that line. Michael wasn't a criminal. His world was made of code, algorithms, systems he could understand and control. But now he found himself in another world, one where the rules weren't written in logic, but in greed, fear, and lies. Emily was right. He knew how to find weaknesses, how to break systems. His programming skills, his ability to analyze data and bypass defenses, could be their weapon. But agreeing to do so meant more than betraying his principles. It meant becoming part of her darkness, part of Lilith, which had already consumed the woman he loved. He turned back to the laptop that had become his bane. The folder with Emily's client files was still open, its contents, photos, videos, correspondence lay out before him like a map of a dangerous labyrinth. Senator Crow, Magnate Wayland, Judge Thorne, and of course Mr. D, the man whose shadow hung over it all. Michael knew that if he agreed, there was no turning back. But he also knew that he couldn't just walk away. Not after he'd seen her eyes full of fire, not after he'd felt her heat, her power. He was trapped between the love that still clung to his heart and the fear of what he might become. "Okay," he said into the void, his voice barely audible. "I'm in." Emily woke up around midday, her hair a mess and her eyes still holding the same challenge he'd seen the night before. She wasn't surprised when he told her his decision. Instead, she nodded, her lips curling into a small smile, as if she knew he couldn't refuse. "You made the right choice, Michael," she said, her voice soft but steely. "We're a team now." They started small. Emily picked her first client, a lawyer named Richard Lawson, who wasn't as powerful as a senator or a mogul, but was rich enough to pay. His file included correspondence with Emily in which he described his preferences in career-destroying detail and several incriminating photographs taken in a room at the Drake. Michael handled the technical side. He created an anonymous email address, protected by layers of encryption, and wrote a message that was brief but clear. "We know who you are and what you've been doing. $50,000 to the account listed within 48 hours, or your secrets will be publicly known." Sending the email was like jumping into icy water. Michael felt his heart pounding as his fingers hovered over the enter key. Emily stood behind him, her hand on his shoulder, her breathing calm, almost indifferent. "Press," she said, and he pressed. The next 2 days were excruciating. Michael checked the account he'd set up through a proxy every few hours, expecting the police to raid their apartment or for Lawson to somehow figure them out. But nothing happened. Then, on the morning of the second day, the money arrived, $50,000, no questions asked, no attempt to contact. Emily smiled when he showed her the balance. "See, They're paying because they know they're going to lose. Michael didn't feel triumphant. He felt the dirt that seemed to have eaten into his skin. But he didn't stop. A businessman came next, then another lawyer. Michael refined his methods. He forged metadata, cleaned digital tracks, used proxies and VPNs to make their actions invisible. Emily selected targets, wrote letters, her words like blades, precise and deadly. They worked like a machine, their movements synchronized, but a chasm grew between them. Every time he looked at her, he saw not Emily, but Lilith, a woman who enjoyed this game, who thrived in her shadow. The money started pouring in. Hundreds of thousands of dollars were deposited in anonymous accounts, which Michael moved through several offshore banks to cover his tracks. They didn't spend it. Emily insisted they save it until they were ready for the big one. Michael didn't ask what she meant, but he sensed that it was all leading to Mr. D. Mr. D was their ultimate target, their white whale. His was the most comprehensive file: videos, photos, wiretaps, even documents that hinted at his criminal ties. Emily told Michael that he wasn't just a rich man, he was someone who held the strings of power, a man whose influence extended far beyond Chicago. "If we do this right," she said, her eyes shining, "we won't just get money, we'll get freedom." They had been preparing for the blow for weeks. Michael had hacked his secure email, exploiting a vulnerability he had found in his corporate network, and planted software that monitored his communications. Emily had composed the most daring letter they had ever written: $3 million. One time, and your secrets will remain hidden. They had sent it with bated breath, knowing that this was more than just blackmail. It was a challenge to the man who could destroy them with one call. The answer came quicker than they expected. Mr. D didn't haggle. He agreed, transferring $3 million to the specified account within 24 hours. Michael checked the balance, his hands shaking as he saw the numbers. It was too easy, too clean. He looked at Emily, who was standing by the window, her face unreadable. "We did it," she said, but there was no joy in her voice, only tension. And then it all came crashing down. The next day, the account was empty. $3 million had vanished, as if they had never existed. Michael checked the system, his fingers flying across the keyboard, but there was no trace, no transactions, no records, nothing. He dug through the logs, checked his proxies, but everything was clean, as if someone had erased their digital footprint with surgical precision. And then he noticed that the correspondence with Mr. D had disappeared from their encrypted server. His profile, his dossier, even the backups, everything was gone. "It's him," Emily said, her voice cold but panicked. She stood at the table, her fingers gripping the edge. "He figured us out. He took the money and he disappeared." Michael looked at her, his mind refusing to accept what was happening. "How? I cleared everything. No one could." "You don't understand," she snapped, her eyes flashing. "Mr. D isn't just a man. He has resources we didn't even know he had. He knew we were coming for him, and now he's playing us." Michael felt his stomach clench. They had been so careful, so sure of their invulnerability, but now they stood on the edge, with an abyss beneath them. He opened his laptop, searching for anything, a trace, a hint, anything that might indicate where Mr. D had gone. But his tracks were erased, as if he were a ghost. Emily walked up to him, her hand on his shoulder, but her touch was cold. "We're not giving up," she said, her voice firm. "We'll find him, we'll get the money back, and we'll finish this." But Michael wasn't so sure. He looked at her face, which was now a mask of determination, and he knew they had crossed a line of no return. They weren't just blackmailers, they were the hunted. And Mr. D, whoever he was a hunter who knew how to corner them. Michael found himself back at the Black Cat that night, his refuge the last anchor in a world that was collapsing. Lou poured him a whiskey, his eyes heavy, as if he could feel Michael drowning. Vivian appeared, her navy blue dress replaced by a low-cut black one, her eyes immediately catching his desperation. She sat down next to him, her scent a mix of musk and cigarettes, the only thing that felt real. "You look like someone who just lost everything," she said, her voice soft but with its usual sharp edge. What happened, Michael? Did your game go wrong? He took a sip, feeling the whiskey burn his throat. We took 3 million, he said quietly, his voice shaking. From Mr. D, and then he disappeared. And the money, it's all gone. Vivian narrowed her eyes, glittering as if she could see the end of this story. 3 million? Oh, Michael, you and your Lilith are going after too big a fish. Mr. D is not one to be caught. He's always one step ahead. Do you know who he is? He asked, his voice shaking. She shrugged, her smile cold. Maybe I do. Maybe I don't. But I do know that people like him don't just disappear. He hasn't run away, Michael. He's planning to strike. And if you're not careful, he'll destroy you both. Michael gripped the glass, his fingers white. What should I do? He asked, his voice almost pleading. Vivian leaned closer, her voice almost a whisper. You've crossed the line, Michael. You have two choices now. Run while you can, or go to the end, even if it kills you. But know this, your Emily, your Lilith, she won't stop. And if you stay with her, you'll become just like her. She stood up, leaving him alone with his whiskey and his thoughts, which were like shards of a broken mirror. Michael stared at the neon lights outside the window, at the reflection of his face, which was no longer his. He knew Vivian was right, but he also knew he couldn't leave Emily. Not when they had crossed a line together, when their lives were bound not only by love, but by crime. The only question was whether they could find Mr. D and whether they would survive if they did. Chicago in the morning was like an old sepia movie, gray and cold, with a haze that clung to the skyscrapers as if the city were trying to hide its sins. Michael sat at the kitchen table, his fingers fiddling with an empty coffee cup, the laptop in front of him that had become his personal Calvary. The disappearance of $3 million and Mr. D had been a punch to the gut, but now it seemed like only the beginning. Emily, or Lilith, as he increasingly called her in his thoughts, was somewhere in the city, trying to find traces of their missing prey. Her determination frightened him. She was like a cornered predator, ready to fight to the death. But Michael sensed that their game had gone too far, and the shadows they had awakened were beginning to move. The last few days had been like running through a minefield. Michael had been checking their systems, looking for any loopholes Mr. D could use to track them down, but all he had found was empty air. His proxies, his encryption, his fake accounts, they were all there, but it didn't comfort him. He knew that a person who could erase 3 million and disappear wouldn't leave a trace by accident. Emily, on the other hand, was full of energy, her eyes shining as she talked about how they would get theirs back. She dug through her old contacts, met with people whose names Michael didn't know, come home late, smelling of cigarettes and someone else's perfume. He hadn't asked. He hadn't wanted to know. But her words, "We'll find him," sounded like a spell that could summon demons. That night, when everything changed, Emily didn't come home. Michael waited until 3 in the morning, his phone silent, his messages unanswered. He paced the apartment like a caged animal, his mind conjuring up images of a car accident, an arrest, or worse. By 5 in the morning, he was ready to call the hospital, but instead he heard a knock on the door. Not loud, but insistent, as if someone knew he was there. Michael froze, his heart pounding. He walked to the door, his hand on the baseball bat he kept by the door in case of an emergency. Through the peephole, he saw an empty hallway, but there was a small package wrapped in black cloth at the threshold. He opened the door, looked around, but the street was empty. The package was light, almost weightless. Inside was a flash drive, unmarked, black as obsidian. Michael felt a chill run down his spine. He went back into the apartment, locked the door, and sat down at the laptop. His fingers trembled as he inserted the flash drive. A folder appeared on the screen with one file, a video, untitled, dated today. He clicked on the file and his world came crashing down. On the screen was Emily. Her face was pale, her eyes were darkly bruised, and her lips were split. She was sitting in a chair, her hands tied behind her back, in a dark room lit only by a dim lamp. The camera zoomed in, and Michael saw the fear in her eyes, a fear he had never seen in Lilith. A voiceover, distorted and low, said, You thought you could play with us, Michael. You and your whore have gone too far. Emily flinched as someone off camera hit her head snapping back and blood pouring from her mouth. Michael clenched his fists, his nails digging into his palms, but he couldn't look away. The video was only a minute long, but every second was like a knife being driven into his chest. It ended with the words, "Wait for instructions, or she dies." Michael sat staring at the black screen, his breathing heavy as lead. Emily was missing. Someone had taken her, someone knew his name, knew what they were doing. It wasn't Mr. D or just him. It was something bigger, someone who wanted more than just their money back, who wanted to punish them. But for what? For blackmail? Or for something he didn't even know about? He didn't sleep. He couldn't. His mind was like an overloaded processor trying to process too much data. He sifted through their files, trying to find anything that might point to who had done this. But Mr. D's file had been wiped, and his other clients, a senator, a mogul, a judge, seemed too small for such revenge. Michael knew he had to act, but his hands were shaking and his thoughts were racing. He called Danny, his old friend who had helped him hack Emily's laptop. Danny answered on the first ring, his voice sleepy but alert. "Mike? What the hell? It's 5 in the morning," he grumbled. "Emily's missing," Michael said, his voice hoarse. "Someone sent me a video. She's being tortured. They know who I am. I need your help." There was silence on the other end of the line, and then Danny cursed. "Damn, Mike, what have you gotten yourself into? I told you this was a dark path." "Just come," Michael cut him off. "Please." Danny was there an hour later, his face grim, his bag of equipment in hand. He plugged the flash drive into his laptop, running programs that analyzed the video's metadata. "Someone did a good job," he said, his fingers flying across the keyboard. "The file is clean, no traces, but I can try to track where it was sent from. It'll take a while." Michael nodded, his gaze glued to the screen, where the freeze frame of Emily's face still hung. He couldn't look at her, but he couldn't look away either. "They said I should wait for instructions," he said quietly. "We can't search yet. Who knows what they—" He didn't have to finish. Danny knew what it meant. They both knew what it meant. He knew what it meant. He was in it. He knew what it meant. It meant someone could. He kept working, his fingers moving. "You weren't just blackmailing people, Michael. You were intruding on their world," Danny said, not looking up from the screen. "It's like being drunk. They're not people. They're falling." He figured out that Emily might be connected somewhere. The IP address led to an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town, a weak lead, but Michael seized on it. He didn't wait for instructions. He knew time was against him. He grabbed the gun Emily kept in her safe, an old Glock he'd never even known existed, and drove, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. The warehouse was a nightmare. Rusty walls, broken windows, the smell of damp. He walked through the door, gun at the ready, though he barely knew how to use it. It was dark inside, only shafts of light filtering through cracks, illuminating the dust. He called to her, quietly, "Emily?" Silence. Then footsteps, not his. Michael turned, his gun shaking. A man stepped out of the shadows, tall, in a black coat, with a face carved from stone. His eyes were ice, in his hand a knife. "You're Michael," he said, his voice low and accented. "You came for her. You're late." Michael clutched the gun. "Where is she?" The man smiled, grinning. "Your woman got into something she shouldn't have. This is war. You are pawns." Michael stepped forward, gun aimed. "Where is she?" "You don't shoot." He threw the flash drive at Michael's feet. "Look, think about it," and disappeared. At home, Michael opened the second flash drive. Emily, bloodied, screaming. A voice spoke of stolen secrets. "Give them back, or she dies." He found files, lists, transactions, codes, a network linked to Mr. D. Emily had hacked into a system larger than them. Now they were hunting. In the Black Cat, Vivian looked at him. "You're in trouble," she said. "This isn't blackmail. This is war. Run, or give them what they want. But your Lily knew. She didn't tell me. Michael knew he couldn't run. He had to find Emily, even if the truth killed him. The hunt was on, and he was the hunter for her, for salvation, for the truth. Michael drove down a deserted road where the asphalt dissolved into dust, and the Chicago skyline had long since disappeared behind him. The night was moonless, and only the headlights snatched bits of sand and the occasional thorny bush that clung to the side of the road like ghosts. His hands gripped the wheel, his knuckles white, and his mind was racing with one thought: find Emily. The video of her torture, the mercenaries' words, the encrypted files, it all felt like a puzzle he couldn't put together, but he knew the answer was waiting for him in the desert. The flash drive the man in the black coat had thrown him contained not only the second video, but also coordinates a point in Nevada, hundreds of miles from the city, where there was nothing but abandoned mines and rumors of secret deals. He hadn't told Danny, hadn't returned to the Black Cat, hadn't confided in Vivian. This was his burden, his war, and he had to finish it himself. The drive stretched on forever, and the silence in the car was almost tangible, broken only by the hum of the engine and his own breathing, which sounded like a death rattle. He thought of Emily, her laughter when they were first married, her tired eyes after night shifts at the hospital, her cold smile when she became Lilith. She had changed him, drawn him into a game where the stakes were higher than he could have imagined. But even now, knowing what she was hiding, knowing she had walked into a web that could destroy them both, he couldn't leave her. Love, hate, betrayal, all mixed inside him like poison, he drank willingly. The coordinates led him to an abandoned complex surrounded by a rusty fence. The buildings that had once been part of the mine were now skeletal, their walls crumbling in the wind and their windows gaping empty. Michael stopped the car, his hand on the Glock tucked into his jacket pocket. He stepped out, and the desert cold hit him like a slap, penetrating his skin. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled, its voice the only sound in the deathly silence. Michael walked toward the main building, his footsteps crunching on the gravel, his heart pounding like it wanted to burst out of his chest. It was dark inside, smelling of damp and metal. He turned on the flashlight on his phone, the beam of light sliding across rusted beams and crumbling walls. He called her, his voice hoarse. "Emily?" There was silence, but he sensed he was not alone. Shadows moved in the corners, and every sound, the creak of floorboards, the rustle of sand, felt like a threat. He walked down the stairs to the basement, where the air was heavy as a tomb. There, in the center of the room, he saw her. Emily sat in a chair, her hands and feet bound with ropes, her face bruised. Her eyes, once bright with defiance, were now empty, but she was alive. Michael rushed toward her, his fingers shaking as he tried to untie the knots. "Emily, I'm here," he whispered, his voice breaking. She looked up at him, her lips moving, but instead of words, he heard only a faint moan. Before he could free her, the light flared, filling the room with a cold white glow. Michael turned, his gun in his hand, but he froze. A man stood in the doorway, tall, in a dark suit, with a face that was both familiar and alien. His eyes were predatory, and his smile was a blade ready to cut. It was Mr. D. "You came, Michael," he said, his voice smooth as silk, but there was a threat in it. "I knew you couldn't leave her." Michael pointed the gun at him, his hands shaking. "Let her go," he said, his voice rough with rage. "This is between us." Mr. D laughed, his laughter echoing off the walls. "Between you and me? Oh, Michael, you're so naive. You think this is about money? About blackmail? There's so much more to it than you can comprehend." He stepped forward, and Michael saw two men standing behind him, mercenaries, their faces hidden by masks and machine guns in their hands. Michael realized his gun was useless, but he didn't lower it. "You took the money," he said, trying to buy time. "3 million. You erased the traces. Why? What do you want?" Mr. D stopped, his eyes narrowing. "Money? It's nothing, Michael. Your Emily, your Lilith, she got into things she shouldn't have. She found our network, the club that holds this world in its hands, and she thought she could threaten us. You're lucky you're still alive." Michael looked at Emily, her head down, but he could see her chest heaving. She knew. She knew what she'd gotten herself into, and she hadn't told him. "What network?" he asked, his voice shaking. "What are you hiding?" Mr. D smiled, his teeth flashing in the lamplight. "We are the shadow power, Michael. The people who decide who lives and who dies. The politicians, the tycoons, the judges, they are all our pawns. We hold their secrets, their lives, their destinies. And your Emily stole some of it. She thought she could blackmail us, but she only awakened the beast." Michael felt his blood run cold. The files he'd found on her laptop, the lists, the transactions, the codes, it wasn't just about money. It was about power, a network that stretched from Chicago to Washington. And he and Emily had become its enemies. "You're not dead," Michael said, his voice almost a whisper. "You were here the whole time." Mr. D nodded. "Disappearance is an art, Michael. I let you think you had one to lure you here, and now you have a choice." He snapped his fingers, and one of the mercenaries walked up to Emily, holding a knife to her throat. She flinched, her eyes meeting Michael's, a mixture of fear and pleading in them. Michael stepped forward, but the second mercenary pointed his machine gun at him, stopping him. "Here are your options," Mr. D said, his voice as cold as the desert beyond the walls. "You can kill her yourself right now. Take a knife, slit her throat, and I'll let you go. You'll go back to your life with the money we give you. Or you can refuse and you both die, slowly, painfully." Michael felt his world shrink to a point. He looked at Emily, her face covered in blood, her eyes that were still hers despite everything she had done. He remembered their first night, their wedding, her laughter, her lies, her passion, her betrayal. She had destroyed him, but she was his, and now he had to choose her life or their death. "You're sick," he said, his voice hoarse. "You think I'd do that? Kill her for you?" Mr. D shrugged. "People do amazing things when they're pushed into a corner, Michael. You've blackmailed people, lied, betrayed them. Why not go all the way? Save yourself. She's not worth it." Emily stirred, her voice weak but clear. "Michael, don't. Not for me." Her words were like a blow. She begged him not to save her, not to sacrifice himself. But he couldn't. He couldn't take the knife, couldn't watch her blood run across the floor. But he also couldn't just stand there and wait for them both to be killed. His mind raced, searching for a way out, but there was no way out. This was a trap, and they were both in it. "Why me?" he asked, his voice shaking. "Why don't you kill us yourself?" Mr. D smiled, his eyes glittering like a snake's. "Because it's fun, Michael. Seeing people break, seeing them choose. That's what makes us stronger. You're an experiment, and I want to see what you choose." Michael looked at Emily, her eyes full of tears, but there was a strength in them he hadn't seen before. She wasn't broken, even now. She was Lilith, even at this moment, and he knew he couldn't kill her. Not because he loved her, though that was true, but because that would mean becoming what Mr. D was, a monster. "I won't play by your rules," he said, his voice firm despite the fear clenching his chest. He lowered the gun, his hands shaking, but he looked Mr. D straight in the eyes. "Kill us if you want, but I won't become like you." Mr. D narrowed his eyes, his smile disappearing. "Are you sure, Michael? This is your last chance." Michael nodded, his gaze sliding to Emily. "I love you," he said quietly, and her eyes widened as if she hadn't expected those words. She opened her mouth to respond, but at that moment a gunshot rang out. Michael felt a searing pain in his shoulder, his legs gave way, and he collapsed to the floor. The mercenary standing next to Emily lowered his machine gun, his face expressionless. Emily screamed, her voice full of despair, but Michael barely heard her. His vision was blurry, blood was running down his arm, but he still looked at Mr. D, who stood with his arms crossed, as if watching a performance. "You made a choice," he said, his voice almost disappointed. "Too bad. You could have been useful." He turned to the mercenary and nodded. He raised his machine gun, pointing it at Emily. Michael tried to stand, his hand reaching for her, but the pain was too much. "No!" he screamed, his voice breaking. But no shot rang out. Instead, there was another sound, a dull thud, like something heavy had fallen. The mercenary collapsed, his machine gun falling from his hands. Danny stood behind him, his face pale, holding a metal pipe covered in blood. "Mike!" he shouted, rushing toward him. Mr. D turned, his face twisted in rage. "You!" he growled, but Danny was already moving. He lunged at the second mercenary, his pipe hitting him on the head, and he fell without a sound. Michael, through the pain, crawled toward Emily, his fingers reaching for the ropes, untying them. Mr. D pulled out his gun, but Danny was faster. He lunged at him, and they rolled across the floor, wrestling for the gun. Michael released Emily, her body limp in his arms, but she was alive. "Hold on," he whispered, his voice shaking. "We'll get out of this." The shot rang out, and Michael froze. He looked at Danny, who was standing over Mr. D, his chest heaving, the gun in his hand. Mr. D was lying on the floor, blood pooling beneath him, his eyes empty. "He's dead," Danny said, his voice hoarse. "It's time to go." They ran across the desert, Michael supporting Emily, his shoulder burning but not stopping. Danny led them to the car he had stolen to follow Michael. They climbed in, and the engine roared, carrying them away from the mine, away from the blood, away from the shadows. Emily was silent, her head on Michael's shoulder, her breathing shallow. He looked at her face, which was still hers despite everything. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked quietly. "About the network, about them?" She looked at him, her eyes full of pain. "I wish I could protect you," she whispered, "but I'll use everything." He shook his head, his hand squeezing hers. "We're alive," he said. "That's what matters." Danny looked at them through the rearview mirror. "You can't go back to Chicago," he said. "They'll be looking for you. Not him, but others. This network, it doesn't go away." Michael nodded. He knew their lives, their marriage, their world, everything had changed. They were fugitives, but they were together, and that was all that mattered. At the Black Cat, where they never returned, Vivian sat at the counter, her dark green dress gone blood red. Lou poured her a whiskey, his eyes hard. "They're gone," he said quietly. Vivian nodded, her eyes glittering. "They chose their path," she replied, raising her glass. "But the shadows will not let them go, never." He drank, and the neon lights reflected in her eyes like stars in the desert. The Nevada desert was unforgiving, its darkness swallowing everything but the dim light of the headlights, which cast long shadows across the sand. The car Danny had stolen sped down the deserted road, the engine roaring like a wounded animal, the cabin silent, blood-soaked and fearful. Michael held Emily close, her body weak but warm, her breath a soft whisper. His shoulder throbbed from the wound, blood soaking his jacket, but he felt no pain. All that mattered was getting out, saving her, saving them. Danny kept his hands on the wheel, glancing in the rearview mirror, his face tense, as if he expected the shadows from the mine to follow them. "Hang in there," Danny said, his voice hoarse, almost drowned out by the roar of the engine. "We're almost to the highway. We'll find help there." Michael nodded, but his gaze was fixed on Emily. Her eyes, half-lidded, were looking past him, as if she could already see what was waiting for them over the horizon. "We did it," he whispered, his fingers stroking her hair, matted with blood and dust. "We made it." She tried to smile, but her lips only trembled. "Michael," her voice was weak, like a whisper in the wind. "Forgive me." He shook his head, his throat tightening. "Not now. We'll figure this out. Together." But the words hung in the air, heavy as a premonition. Danny jerked the wheel, the car swerved, and Michael felt his body sway. "What the—" he began, but Danny cut him off. "Headlights," he said, his voice tense. "Behind us. They're coming for us." Michael turned, his heart clenching. In the distance, in the cloud of dust, were lights too. No, 3 sets of headlights, approaching quickly. They weren't the police. They were the shadows Vivian had warned about, the web he and Emily had disturbed. Mr. D was dead, but his death hadn't stopped those behind him. "Danny, hurry," Michael said, his voice shaking. He pulled Emily closer, his hand tightening on the Glock that was still in his pocket. The gun was nearly empty, but he wasn't going to give up. Danny stomped on the gas, the car lurched forward, but the pursuers were not far behind. Their headlights grew brighter, their engines roared like predators on a trail. Emily stirred, her fingers tightening on his arm. "Michael, if we don't get out." "We'll get out," he snapped, his voice firm, but inside he was screaming. He couldn't lose her, not after everything they'd been through. Not after he'd refused to kill her, not after he'd chosen her over himself. Suddenly, the night was torn apart by the sound of a gunshot. The car's rear window shattered, shards raining down on them, and Emily screamed. Michael ducked, shielding her with his body, his hand gripping the gun. "Danny, keep going," he shouted, leaning out the window. He could see the black subs, their silhouettes ghosts in the dust. He fired, aiming for the tires, but his hand was shaking, and the bullet went off into the darkness. Another shot. Danny flinched, his shoulder stained with blood, but he didn't let go of the wheel. "Shit," he cursed, his voice thick with pain. "Michael, they're not stopping. We're not getting away." Michael looked at him, then at Emily. Her eyes were open, but there was something else in them, not panic, but acceptance. She squeezed his hand tighter. "Michael, let go," she whispered. "One of us has to." "No," he said, his voice breaking. He couldn't choose. But Danny was right, they were trapped, and time was running out. The subs were already there, their headlights blinding, their gunshots tearing through the night. Michael looked at Emily, at her face, still hers despite the blood, despite the pain, despite everything she'd done. He loved her, and he hated her, and he couldn't lose her. "Danny, turn," he said, his voice cold as steel, towards the cliff. Danny looked at him, his eyes widening. "Are you serious?" "Do it," Michael said. He didn't know what was waiting for them there, but he knew he wouldn't let them take Emily. He wouldn't let them win. Danny nodded, his expression grim. He yanked the wheel hard, the car swerving off the road, its wheels skidding in the sand. The subs followed, their gunshots getting closer. Michael pulled Emily close, his lips brushing her forehead. "I'm with you," he whispered. The car hurtled toward the edge of a cliff that was barely visible in the darkness. Danny gripped the wheel, his breathing heavy. "Hang on," he said, his voice a mixture of fear and determination. Shot. Darkness. The sand was cold, grains clinging to skin like memories. Someone lay on the edge of a cliff, their breathing faint, almost inaudible. A car, wrecked, smoked below, its metal sparkling in the rising sun. The subs were gone, their headlights fading into the night as if they had never existed. The silence of the desert was absolute, broken only by a gentle wind that carried dust and ash. The man rose, their movements slow, painful. Blood trickled down their arm, but they didn't notice. They looked at the wreckage, at the smoke, at the desert that held their secret. Who were they? Michael, with his broken faith and the love that had become his curse. Emily, with her secrets and her power that made her both prey and predator. Or Danny, who had come to save but had paid for it. The desert didn't answer. It only watched as the figure turned and walked away, their steps hesitant but determined. Months later, in a city too bright to keep shadows, a new hotel shone like a beacon. Its marble floors reflected the light from crystal chandeliers, and the air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and ambition. A woman walked into the lobby, her heels clicking on the floor, her movements as smooth as a panther. Her hair, now blonde, was pulled back into an elegant bun, and her dress navy blue, with a low neckline, hugged her figure. She approached the front desk, her smile soft, but her eyes steely. "Good evening," she said, her voice low, with a slight accent that hadn't been there before. "The reservation is for Alice Kane." The receptionist nodded, his fingers tapping rapidly on the keyboard. "Of course, Miss Kane. Your room is ready. Welcome to Aura." She took the key card, her fingers steady, but her gaze slid around the hall, as if she were looking for someone, or something. She turned and headed for the elevator, her step light but with a hint of weariness, as if she were carrying a burden no one could see. She stood alone in the elevator, her reflection in the mirror both familiar and alien. Was this Emily shedding the skin of Lilith to begin anew, or was this another woman born from the ashes of that night in the desert? Her lips curved slightly, but the smile did not reach her eyes. The elevator dinged, the doors opened, and she stepped out, her silhouette fading into the hallway like smoke. At the Black Cat in Chicago, Vivian sat at the bar, her red dress replaced by a black as the night that swallowed them all. Lou poured her a whiskey, his face grim, as if he knew more than he was letting on. "Hear anything?" he asked, his voice low. Vivian shook her head, her fingers twirling her glass. "Nothing," she said, her eyes glittering in the neon light. "But someone survived. I can feel it." Lou chuckled, his gaze sliding to the window where the city lived its own life, unaware of what secrets it held. "Whoever it was, they're not coming back," he said. "Not here." Vivian nodded, her lips brushing the rim of her glass. "After midnight, everything changes," she whispered, and the words hung in the air like an echo from the night the gunshot had torn through the darkness. Some survived, some left, and some, under a new name, started a new game. But the desert kept its secrets, and Chicago didn't ask questions. Friends, thank you for being with us. Subscribe if you are interested in such stories. There are a lot of exciting things ahead. We are trying for you, and any support is a huge motivation to continue. If something can be improved, write in the comments with kindness. Subscribe to our channel so that your love doesn't cheat on you, and go ahead and listen to the next story, because this story is nothing compared to the next one. If you're under 18, don't even think, click to the next one.